Namaste, everybody. Hearty greetings from Vedanta House in Bindweide. Welcome back to our online meetings. We hope you are all safe and in sound health. Before I begin, I would like to extend my thanks to all of you for the interest you have been taking in these classes. Thank you very much for giving us an opportunity, to think of God in the company of devotees like you. I assume everybody has arrived. Today's class is part of our series on Vedanta and Dharma, and it will be of an hour's duration. So let us begin with the invocation. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om. Om. May the Divine protect us. May the Divine bestow upon us the fruit of knowledge. May we obtain the energy to acquire knowledge. May what we study reveal the truth. May we bear no ill feeling towards one another. Om. Peace, peace, peace. Last week, we brought to an end our discussion of devotion to God in all His various aspects. We had started on our next topic of spiritual practice. Spiritual practice as described in the Bhakti scriptures. After having seen how Bhakti Shastras analyze the various forms and degrees of bhakti, we were about to learn something about actual spiritual practice, especially during the primary stages in the life of an aspiring bhakta. We were about to know the ways and means of bhakti. What practical guidance do Bhakti scriptures give to those who earnestly desire to lead a spiritual life? That is our present subject. First of all, these spiritual practices, Bhakti sadhanas, they are divided into what are known as Bahiranga sadhanas and Antaranga sadhanas. Bahiranga sadhanas means external means. Antaranga sadhanas are internal means. What are these external means of developing bhakti? Making offerings, observing vows, studying sacred books, chanting hymns and prayers, repeating God's holy name, going on pilgrimages, seeking holy company, and approaching a spiritual teacher for instruction. All these come under Bahiranga sadhana or external means. And what are the internal means? Antaranga sadhanas. There are mainly three: Vairagya, Jnana, and Yoga. Renunciation, knowledge, and practice. Practice of bhakti disciplines. That is what it means here. Then we heard of that famous Bhagavata classification of bhakti sadhanas. Navavidha bhakti or ninefold devotion. Shravana, Kirtana, Smarana, Padasevana, Archana, Vandana, Dasya, Sakhya, and Atmanivedana. Hearing about God, Shravana. Singing His glories and praises is Kirtana. Remembering Him unceasingly, that is Smarana. Serving Him is Padasevana. Worshipping Him, Archana. Saluting Him is Vandana. Being His servant is Dasya. Being His comrade, Sakhya. And finally, everything leading to surrendering oneself and all that is one's own to Him, to God. That is Atmanivedana. So these are said to be the 9 forms, the 9 limbs of bhakti. But they are also generally accepted as disciplines, sadhanas to be practiced by bhakti margis, disciplines that help a devotee to remain constantly in touch with their chosen ideal. So if a devotee is able to practice all of them, well and good. Bhakti teachers assure him that there is no doubt they will achieve perfection in Bhakti Yoga. But as I mentioned last week, each one of these 9 forms by itself can also be an effective means of cultivating bhakti. And among these 9, 3, especially 3, remembrance, service, surrender, smarana, seva, and samarpana. Atmanivedana is Atma Samarpana. So, smarana, seva, and samarpana are especially powerful ways of developing love and devotion. So, today let us try to know more about these bhakti practices, these 3. First is smarana, constant remembrance of God. As most of us know, the easiest, best, and most effective way of doing this is repeating God's holy name. Japa. Saints and scriptures all over the world have attached very great importance to repetition of God's name. Japa as a way of remembering God unceasingly. Just as God and His form are both the same, God and His name are also one and the same. The form happens to be a visual symbol, and the name is a verbal symbol. So, being the word symbol of God, It is a verbal expression of God who is actually inexpressible. A mantra is said to be the mediator between God and the devotee. So, meditation on God with the help of constant repetition of His name, that is intended to fill the devotee's soul with thoughts of God, resulting in devotion to Him. We have heard of the three forms of worship: physical, verbal, and mental. Of these, the first one, physical, consisting of rituals and ceremonies according to scriptural injunctions. That form of worship has almost fallen out of use these days. This is mainly because of the stress, because of the many other inconveniences of modern social life. An average individual doesn't have the leisure for such elaborate external worship. This tendency was probably noticeable even during the time of the Puranas. That is why the Puranas themselves laid great emphasis more on verbal and mental worship as ways of remembering God, and particularly verbal worship. Chanting of God's name is verbal worship. When only one name is repeated, it is called japa. But when many names are chanted, then it is either called stotra or kirtana. But today we will focus on japa as a way of remembering God unceasingly. I just mentioned that saints and scriptures of all great religions glorify this practice of japa. The Manusmriti says, the seeker after truth reaches the highest goal by japa alone. Reaches the highest goal by japa alone. And in the Mahabharata we read, japa is the best of all spiritual practices. And the Bhagavata, which is considered the greatest devotional scripture for a Hindu, the Bhagavata fully supports this view, saying, that which one obtained through meditation in Satya Yuga, that which one obtained through meditation in Satya Yuga, through sacrifice in Treta Yuga, through worship in Dwapara Yuga, may be attained in Kali Yuga just through japa, just by repeating the name of the Lord. Then Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita says, of all sacrifices, I am the sacrifice of japa. So, of all sacrifices, japa happens to be the highest and best. So what does all this show? It shows that there is great power in the divine name. That is what it shows. Now, this japa is not just mechanical repetition of God's name. Japa implies also thinking of God's form and qualities that should accompany the repetition. So, along with repetition of the name, we should also visualize God's form, the form of one's chosen deity, and also think of God's divine qualities, His purity, His strength, love, compassion. Most people find it easier to visualize their Ishtadevata's form. The Sanskrit word for visualization is bhavana. Bhavana means evoking, calling up the image of God in the heart with love and reverence. Evoking the image of God in the heart with love and reverence. This is bhavana. It is in itself a higher form of mental worship. Mental worship, as you know, is called Manasa Puja. Together with japa, Manasa Puja happens to be the most popular mode of worship practiced today. That is the fact. This kind of visualization plays a very important role in our daily spiritual practice, especially in the beginning. So, japa and bhavana have to go hand in hand. The divine form in the heart must be visualized as living, as real. God has to be alive and real, at least to us. We must visualize Him as luminous and blissful, an image made of consciousness, as Sri Ramakrishna would say. First of all, we must think of ourselves as luminous. We must think of ourselves as spiritual beings and then install the luminous form of our chosen ideal in the luminous center in the region of the heart. Those who have received formal spiritual initiation are taught all these different steps of this kind of visualization. Even after finishing japa and manasa puja in the prescribed way, one has to hold on to one's center of consciousness throughout the day, always trying to remain in that elevated mood that we experience when we are seated on our prayer seats. As sadhakas, we must have three things: a definite center of consciousness, a definite name of God, a definite mantra, and a corresponding holy form. A center of consciousness, a mantra, and a form corresponding to that mantra. In order to be effective, repetition of the mantra and visualization of the Ishtadevata's form, they must be done with great intensity, with great concentration. It is only then that it becomes real smarana, remembrance. Worship, according to Vedanta, means something special. It is not something to be done and be over with. It indicates a deep and intimate relationship between God and devotee. An intimate relationship. It means upasana, which means approaching the divine step by step until the self attains identity with Him. This is what upasana is. Approaching God step by step until I become one with Him. That is what mystic worship is. In Vedanta, worship in essence means mystic worship. One begins with physical images, moves up to mental images and repetition of the divine name, mantra, and finally it leads to the union of the soul with God. physical images to mental and verbal images, and then to the union of the soul with God. And as we heard at the beginning, japa, constant remembrance of God with the help of a mantra, happens to be the mode of worship that is best suited to our modern lifestyle. So, smarana through japa, constant remembrance of God through repetition of the divine name, this should be done in a spirit of mystic worship. When this spirit is lost, then it all becomes mechanical very soon. Very often we forget this central point, that smarana and bhavana, or smarana that includes japa and bhavana, that should be done in the spirit of mystic worship. If that element is absent, then it becomes mechanical. The feeling of love, the feeling of adoration must always be alive, so that smarana becomes an effective spiritual discipline. No doubt, as Holy Mother Sharada Devi used to say, even mechanical japa has some value, because the divine name itself, the mantra itself, has its inherent power. No doubt of that. But when it is done with devotion, in loving remembrance, as a form of worship, then our whole being, our body, mind and soul respond to that. This is how God, the soul of our souls, can be reached merely through remembrance. By remembering Him with love. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, japa means silently repeating God's name in solitude. Silently repeating God's name in solitude. When you chant His name with single-minded devotion, you can see God's form and realize Him. Then he gives a beautiful illustration how japa functions. Suppose there is a piece of timber, a big piece of timber, sunk in the water of the Ganga and fastened with a chain to the bank. You proceed link by link, holding the chain. And when you approach the water, you dive into it, you dive into the water and follow the chain. Finally, you are able to reach the timber. In the same way, by repeating God's name, you become absorbed in Him and finally realize Him. So, every little act of remembrance, each repetition of the mantra takes us nearer and nearer to God. The sound calls up the idea of God, and the idea, sooner or later, brings us in touch with the thing itself. So we should see that our practice of smarana becomes better and better in quality with each passing day. We should try to do it more and more, consciously, intelligently. Always think of the chain and try to get hold of the next link. That is how to practice japa. This is how we can easily approach God, get closer and closer to Him. It doesn't matter even if it is a little mechanical at times. These stages are unavoidable. But if the practice is kept up, even mechanical practice, steadiness of mind will come. And later on we will find that meditation becomes easier. Meditation is actually, from a devotee's point of view, meditation is the extension of japa. In a way, japa is meditation with breaks, and meditation is japa without breaks. You could put it like that. Of course, meditation is a much more intensive process. But if we want to have meditation later, we must first practice japa now. In fact, in the beginning of spiritual life, we need not bother so much about meditation. It is enough to remember God in whatever way we can. In fact, in our case, japa is the only thing we can really do. It is only out of courtesy that we sometimes call it meditation. If we make japa and practice constant remembrance of our Ishta Devata, if we do this much day in and day out, in due course that will develop into dhyana, or unbroken thought of God. In spiritual life, it is not enough to spend 1 or 2 hours in the morning and evening in prayer and so-called meditation. Something of that mood has to be maintained throughout the day. There has to be an undercurrent of the thought of God, even when we are engaged in our day-to-day duties. That is what is known as the practice of the presence of God. To maintain an undercurrent, a background memory of God, even when we are busy with day-to-day activities. This must supplement our daily prayer and meditation. But if it is done properly, sincerely, that is by itself an intense spiritual practice. The main thing in all this is the importance of fixing the mind on God and keeping it fixed on God always. The mind should never be allowed to come down below a certain threshold. When does that happen? When does our mind sink down? When we forget God. When we forget God and become immersed in worldly affairs. The moment we let go of the chain, of remembrance, we are lost. Works and duties are unavoidable. But even these can be converted into means of keeping contact with our Ishta Devata. And unless we do it, a little prayer, japa or meditation done in the morning and evening may not help that much. The main thing is to try to remember the Lord always. And the only way of doing this is by connecting everything that we do to Him. And mantra japa is the best means of establishing and maintaining this connection. It all takes practice. But through practice, we will be able to remember God constantly. We will be able to keep God in mind even while our hands are busy with work. In fact, this is how we will be able to transform work into worship and be nearer to God. Of course, regular prayer and meditation are most essential, but that is not enough. That is what I am trying to say. Something of the prayerful and meditative mood has to be continued during the time of work also. Then even the work we do becomes an offering to God. It becomes a form of spiritual practice. It becomes a way of being in touch with God. As much effective as prayer and meditation themselves. Even Shankaracharya says in one of his hymns, "Whatever I do, O Lord, is your worship. Whatever I do is your worship." And this is the result of constant remembrance. So we see how smarana leads to an awareness of God's presence, which in turn converts all work into His seva, God's service. When we connect everything that we do with our Ishtadevata through the mantra, then even ordinary work becomes service of God. So the main thing again is to feel an intense love for God, to establish a proper relationship with Him. If there is true love for our chosen ideal, that love tends to be expressed in work. As one of our senior Swamis used to say, when a lover loves his beloved, he doesn't sit around saying, "I love you, I love you, I love you." He does something for her. Just as every little thing that a mother does for her child, every little thing that the lover does for his beloved is an expression of their love. In the same way, every form of work becomes an expression of the devotee's love and adoration of God. Work is no longer work. Work becomes an act of loving service. Now that brings us to the second of our three main bhakti practices: Smarana, Seva and Samarpana. We were discussing Smarana until now, and now we come to the second, Seva, serving God. But now, let us briefly return to the Bhakti Yoga chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Arjuna wanted to know which devotee was the better yogi. Which devotee was the better yogi? Those ever steadfast devotees who worship the personal God, or those others who worship the impersonal absolute? If you remember, Krishna's answer was, those who have fixed their minds on me, that is to say, the personal God, those who have fixed their minds on me and who, ever steadfast, endowed with supreme faith, worship me, them I hold to be perfect in yoga. Then, 2 or 3 verses later, he again says, those who consecrate all their actions to me, those who consecrate all their actions to me, regarding me as the supreme goal, and who worship me, meditating on me with single-minded concentration. To them whose minds are thus absorbed in me, I become the savior from the ocean of samsara. These few verses of the Bhakti Yoga chapter we have already discussed. Then Krishna continues, therefore, fix your mind on me alone, rest your thought on me alone, and in me alone you will live hereafter. Of this there is no doubt. Fix your mind on me alone, rest your thoughts on me alone, and in me alone you will live hereafter. Of this there is no doubt. But if the devotee, because of their weakness, if the devotee should find it difficult to fix the mind on God in this way, then Krishna suggests a simpler way. We know how hard it is to think of God and God alone all the time. That is meditation. But for devotees like us, Krishna, the Lord, makes a concession. He says, if you are unable to fix the mind steadily on me, then seek to reach me by the yoga of constant practice. If you are unable to fix the mind steadily on me, seek to reach me by the yoga of constant practice, Abhyasa Yoga. So what is this Abhyasa Yoga? Practice means withdrawing the mind from everything else and fixing it on one ideal. And doing it again and again, that is what is known as practice, Abhyasa. So, the yoga of constant practice means the steadiness of mind acquired by such relentless practice. If it is impossible for me to fix my mind on God alone, then I should try to steady my mind, my thoughts, by repeated practice, so that it can be directed to the Lord. That is what we were discussing today until now. Smarana, constant remembrance of God, leading to an awareness of His presence. Wherever we are and whatever we may be doing. That is practice of the presence of God. Then Krishna makes a further concession, apparently lowering the qualification bar. Lowering the qualification bar for Bhakti Yoga, if such an expression may be used. He goes on to say, if you are incapable of constant practice, then devote yourself to my service. For even by rendering service to me, you will attain perfection. If you are incapable of constant practice, devote yourself to my service. Even by rendering service, you will attain perfection. Now, much has to do with the context of the Bhagavad Gita. The way it is said in this chapter, in Bhakti Yoga, it makes it sound as if acts of service are inferior to those of prayer, worship, or meditation. But it is not like that. It need not be like that, because there are minds that are temperamentally unsuited for prayer or worship. Temperamentally unsuited. To be even more precise, unsuited for prayer or worship as they are commonly understood. It is very, very important to make this distinction, to be aware of these finer things. Temperamentally unsuited for prayer or worship as they are commonly understood. That is the whole point of having different yogas. Swami Vivekananda said, as many minds, so many yogas. Why not? It is not that one is superior to another. It is not that those minds are incapable, not that they are unable. It is just that their way of praying and worshipping is different. They have a different way of praying and worshipping. For that matter, at the end of the second chapter of the Gita, Sankhya Yoga, where Krishna is talking about self-knowledge, towards the end of that chapter, we find Arjuna asking Krishna, what are the characteristics of one who has attained steady wisdom through samadhi, sthita prajna? What are the characteristics of one who has attained steady wisdom through samadhi? How would you describe a sthita prajna? And Krishna gives an 18-verse long answer, 18 verses long, in great detail. He describes in such great detail the characteristic attributes of an enlightened soul, a jnani. And at the beginning of his commentary on those verses, the great Shankaracharya makes a very significant observation. He writes, the means of attaining knowledge are also the characteristic attributes of the person who has attained that knowledge. I repeat, the means of attaining knowledge are also the characteristic attributes of the person who has attained that knowledge. Because in this discipline, Jnana Yoga, in this discipline, the means and the end are the same. Which means, if I want to attain steady wisdom, if I want to attain samadhi, in other words, if I want to be like those illumined souls, like the sthita prajnas, jivan muktas, then I will have to do as they do. I'll have to live as they live. I will have to imitate them. Because in spiritual life, the means and the end are the same. The goal and the way are the same. It is no different in Bhakti Yoga either. If a devotee who has realized God pours out their heart in His service, then I, an aspiring devotee, will also have to follow in their footsteps if I want to become like them. It's a question of love, bhakti. It's a matter of temperament. So where is the question of high or low? Besides this, loving service has a certain advantage. It is completely objective. Every one of us will agree that objective concentration, Objective concentration is much easier than subjective concentration. We all know that from personal experience. It's far easier for us to focus our mind on things outside than to turn the mind inward and try to concentrate it on something abstract. All we are required to do in objective concentration as a bhakti yoga discipline, all that we are required to do is look upon that particular object, look upon the object of our attention as a manifestation of the God whom we adore. That is all. Now, with this background, what does it mean to serve God? How can I offer loving service to God, to my Ishta Devata? A simple answer is, to serve God means to do God's work. So what is God's work? We hear this expression used so frequently, God's work, God's work. What is this God's work? In a very wide sense, the whole world is the Lord's. He has become everything Himself. So everything that I do as a part of that whole, everything that I do as a member of human society with a view to promoting its welfare, keeping in mind that the world is nothing but God Himself in another form, that will be God's work. Everything that I do as a member of human society with a view to promoting its welfare, that is God's work. To do all my duties with the feeling that I am God's servant, to feel or to acknowledge inwardly that even my capacity to serve Him is His gift. So the results of my work also belong to Him. This is what God's work is. To do everything with this feeling. At the end of His teaching in the Gita, at the end of the 18th chapter, Krishna says these famous words: by worshipping Him from whom all beings originate, and by whom the whole universe is pervaded, by worshipping Him through the performance of duty, one attains perfection. By worshipping Him from whom all beings originate and by whom the whole universe is pervaded. Who is that? That is Ishvara, Saguna Brahman, who has become this universe and all its living beings. By worshipping Him through the performance of my duty, I can attain perfection. So, duty must be performed as an act of worshipful service. I must not seek any personal gain from my work. I must regard myself only as an instrument in the fulfillment of a divine purpose. The divine purpose may be too large for me to understand. I can only try. So, serving God does not mean anointing God's feet. It is not massaging God's feet. At least it is not only that. It means serving God in His manifestation as this world with all its living beings, with the feeling that God dwells in all. That is real seva. If I am devoted to this, if I am devoted to God's work in this spirit, then it is real seva. Then I am doing God's work. But apart from this very wide sense, God's work can also have other meanings. For example, working for a holy cause, especially to make it more understandable, actively participating in a work that has been started by an incarnation of God. This is a very concrete example. Participating in the mission of a divine incarnation like Buddha or Christ or Ramakrishna. Taking active part in the work started by them. That is, in some way or other, helping in spreading their message, serving them indirectly through works dedicated to them and their cause. To do all this selflessly, this is also God's work. Then, building and preserving places of worship, organizing religious events, festivals, that is also God's work. All in all, any work that connects us to God, or any work that is connected with God and done sincerely and selflessly, is all God's work. But here one thing has to be remembered: all such organized religious activity that is done on a more or less large scale, it all has to be accompanied by service to society, service of holy people, service of poor people. Even the Bhagavata says any religious activity, private or public, without this component of service to fellow beings, the Bhagavata says it is like offerings poured into ashes instead of fire. It is fruitless and ceases to be God's work. You can remember these Pancha Mahayajnas which every householder is supposed to perform. There we have elements of this kind of service to fellow beings, paying off their debts. But together with this service to others, it becomes an excellent way of doing God's work. I am referring to the Bhagavata words of, without that component of service to fellow beings, Bhagavata says it is all like offerings poured into ashes instead of fire, and it ceases to be God's work. But together with this, everything becomes an excellent way of doing God's work. It is not for nothing that Swami Vivekananda said these words, these famous words. This is the gist of all worship, to be pure and to do good to others. This is the gist of all worship, to be pure and to do good to others. He who sees God in the poor, in the weak, and in the deceased, he really worships God. And if he sees God only in the image, his worship is but preliminary. Swamiji says, he who has served and helped even one poor person, seeing God in him, without thinking of their caste or creed or race or anything. With him, God is more pleased than with the man who sees him only in temples. In another place, in one of his poems, the name of the poem is To a Friend. In that, it's a fairly long poem, but it is exquisite. There Swamiji says, "From highest Brahman to yonder worm, and to the very minutest atom, everywhere is the same God, the all-love. Friend, offer mind, soul, body at their feet." He doesn't say God's feet. Offer mind, soul, body at their feet. These are his manifold forms before thee. Rejecting them, where seekest thou for God? Who loves all beings without distinction, he indeed is worshipping best his God. From highest Brahman to the yonder worm, and to the very minutest atom, everywhere is the same God, the all-love. Friend, offer mind, soul, and body at their feet. These are his manifold forms before thee. Rejecting them, where seekest thou for God? Who loves all beings without distinction, he indeed is worshipping best his God. So much for today. In our next class, we will briefly look at some inner psychological aspects of service and the place of seva in our scheme of spiritual practice. Then we can take up the subject of surrender, the last one, samarpana, as a way of developing bhakti. So, thank you all very much. Thank you for participating in these meetings and giving us this opportunity for thinking of God together. I sincerely hope and pray that these meetings will have a direct effect on our spiritual life. Thank you. Our next meeting will be tomorrow afternoon at the same time. Swami Baneshanandaji will be giving his class on the Mundaka Upanishad, and it will be followed by half an hour's guided meditation. Now, let us all chant Om 3 times before dispersing. Namaste, goodbye, and I wish you all a nice weekend. Please take care, stay safe, and we'll meet again, God willing, next week. Namaste.